Hi, welcome to your very first PowerPoint in HDFS 332. In this, we'll be talking more about kind of an overview and introduction to talking about death and dying and how to manage death anxiety. People take this class for lots of different reasons. So some people are taking this class for professional reasons, meaning that maybe they're going to be music therapists or occupational therapists, counselors, teachers, law enforcement, social workers, morticians, funeral home directors, and so that could be a big reason. Also, I would say a significant portion of people taking this class are here for personal reasons. I would say maybe up to 20% of students have had a significant loss or have a close family member who is terminally ill. Sometimes people are here just because they're nervous about death and their future, and they want to be more prepared, both for themselves and also how to support others. And then people also have just general curiosity about something that we talk so little about. Here's some reflections from previous students that I'll let you read through. And I think the themes that you can hear are that first, it makes you realize how much you've lost, even non-death losses, and gives you more permission to grieve. Second, as we're going to kind of get into it, it is difficult, yet you might find yourself more connected with people around you, both in class and outside of class. And third, it's going to provide kind of fuel for some really powerful, meaningful, interesting conversations with family and friends, and some skills to be able to better support them. This is a model, the dual process model of grief, that we'll get more into when we talk about grief processes. But I think it's an interesting metaphor for this class. So what this model says is that even when people are grieving, they are moving between being focused on grief and being focused on the rest of their lives. And so similarly, in this class, you might find yourself both being focused on this tough content, death, dying, and grief, but also having kind of reflections and reverberations in your life as well. So in this class, we'll circle back to this at the end of this PowerPoint, we're going to be both loss focused, but also life focused. PowerPoint is divided into two parts. First, basically the meaning that we construct around death, and then second, getting more into death anxiety. So as we're going to be talking about, we all have a different symbolic of construction of death, and that varies based on a number of different factors. So first, it's our time in history. We live in a time now where it's much less likely for children to die, whereas 120 years ago it was a lot more common. So our view is that death happens to older people, not to children. We're going to be spending a whole PowerPoint talking about religion and culture and how they influence our views of death. Media will also be talking about that as well. Media generally is showing more violent or sensationalized death and less kind of normal death experiences. And then, of course, personal experience. And so for me, having grown up with a mom who was, once I was in high school and college, a grief counselor, definitely shaped my experiences. And death is a very common thing in grief that we talk about in my household. So for example, when I was home, a couple of holidays ago, I'm doing a jigsaw puzzle with my daughter, and my mom just says abruptly, "Oh, by the way, I've been wanting to go out and visit my new cemetery site and talk to you about my plans about what I want to have happen after I die." My daughter, who's a young teen, and me are just like, "Okay, yeah, we'll be happy to do that," right? So our family is one that it's very open and can be talked about kind of easily. Here are some examples of different constructions of death based on religion, essentially. So Islam believes that death is final, and it occurs when the angel of death visits the person and removes the soul from their body. In the Hindu tradition, there's no heaven or hell, right? It's reincarnation, and so it's more circular. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's been more of a history of a reward or a punishment, although as we're going to get into, less Jews kind of focus on hell, for example. And in existential psychotherapy, which is Irvin Yalom, one of his existential concerns that I've always resonated with is death. So that we basically are all going to die, and yet most of us don't want to. Just as an aside, the other three existential tensions are structure, our desire for freedom and our need for structure, meaning, that we're born into a world without set meaning, yet we are kind of hardwired to construct it for ourselves, and isolation. We want to and need to be connected to other people, but we also are in some ways alone. We are born alone, we die alone. Okay, so a few things. As you watch this video, know that it might, for example, if you're more religious, especially from the Christian tradition, there's some things in it that just might seem a little bit off-putting to you. This video by Stephen Cave is based on what's called terror management theory, which is this idea that because we fear death and we don't have control over it, we come up with kind of religious and cultural systems or beliefs to kind of manage that fear. He's going to walk through 4 symbolic constructions. Elixir, which is basically using science to stay alive, and I think he refers to cryogenics, is that the freezing of people. But I also think it can just be, I'm very science focused right now in terms of how can I live as long as possible. Resurrection, either from God or science, so a scientist resurrecting you if you've been frozen, or God resurrecting. Soul, the idea that soul goes on to exist after your death. And legacy, which is kind of what impact or echo do you leave in the world. And so you can be thinking which of one of these, resonates the most with you and why. So this leads us to some reflection on what are some of the pros and cons of our symbolic constructions of death, and what does death mean to us? So on the one hand, students often say things like our symbolic constructions of death, our beliefs, right, bring us comfort, and in an otherwise scary time. But one of our cons is that we can really believe that our constructions are right and that other people are wrong. And so we'll want to be cautious about that in this class, that even though our beliefs can feel really right, people might have very different beliefs from us and feel equally right. Okay, let's transition to talking about death anxiety, a topic that I know all too well. And so many students in the class are worried. I would guess maybe 30% of the class struggles with some form of death anxiety. And so hopefully by talking about it, normalizing it, and discussing some strategies, you'll have some tools to manage it as you move through class. Death anxiety can be broadly divided into 2 categories: fears about ourselves, fears about others. On average, younger age is more correlated, even though as you get older, you're more likely to die. So adolescents, emerging adults, young adults have the highest rates of death anxiety. And the way I think about this is, as you get older, you've just gotten more used to worrying about hard things that maybe they just don't quite take so much of a toll on you. As my father-in-law said one time when I asked him why he wasn't so overwhelmed in a situation where I was incredibly overwhelmed, he said, "Oh, I stripped that gear a long time ago." And I just wonder if maybe you strip the gear of death anxiety a little bit as you get older. Females report higher death anxiety than males, and similarly, females report higher rates of anxiety and depression, which are correlated with death anxiety. However, it's unclear if how much females actually experience it more, or just more likely to recognize it and report it. For religious beliefs, this has varied across studies. Some people find religious beliefs are protective and you have less death anxiety, but one research study of college students across several countries, the United States, Malaysia, and Turkey, found that those college students who were more religious actually had more death anxiety, and Muslims specifically had the highest related death anxiety. Your experience with death, of course, is going to influence your chances of death anxiety. So having more trauma in your background can increase your experience of death anxiety. Taking a death education class like this, interestingly, is correlated with lower death anxiety, but we don't know if that's just because people who have high death anxiety don't sign up for a class like this, or is it that the class helps reduce your anxiety? That's what we're hoping for. In terms of mental health issues, you can see these are all, if you have a diagnosis of obsessive compulsive disorder or OCD, PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, depression or anxiety, that all increases your risk of experiencing death anxiety or experiencing and reporting. Just a quick word about OCD. I don't know that I would have met the criteria for OCD growing up. I might have at some points in my life, but certainly when I look back on my life, I can see patterns of OCD-like thinking, which is a less known. We focus more on like OCD behaviors, but OCD or kind of obsessive kind of thought processes, I certainly had a lot of that for a lot of years, and it seemed like I was always focused on a fear. Fear of being kidnapped, fear of something happening to my parents, fear because it was the 1980s that I could be gay, right? Because that was a really scary thing to be in the 1980s. I mean, it still is, but definitely in the 1980s it was. Fear of being raped, fear of my own dying or someone close to me dying. And now I recognize that my brain was just always latching on to something to be scared about, essentially. So in my last year of my undergraduate, I actually took a death and dying class very similar to this one, and we had to keep a journal, and this is what I wrote in the very first week of the class. I'm terrified of having to face the experience. It seems to be in my nature to worry about something, think it through before it happens. It's a way of preparing myself, taking a deep breath and hoping I'm ready. I'm also worried that I'll have to deal with death because my fear is that I won't be able to deal with it. I really don't want to be tested. And so you can hear this, this death anxiety and this kind of almost sense of some omnipotent presence that might put me through a test or a trial or even potentially punish me for not being good enough. So Megan Devine's reading on death anxiety is a student favorite, and often students pass it along to friends or family members that they know struggle with death anxiety. I find her insights really helpful, and they're from a clinical rather than researcher perspective. So she suggests that the reason why we experience death anxiety is evolutionarily, we are trying to kind of always expect and prepare for danger so that we can anticipate it and, avoid bad things from happening. But how this translates is we end up worrying and worrying, and there's never any end, right? Because there's an endless amount of bad things can happen. So it's not like a dangerous event is over and then we can experience some relief. We kind of can put ourselves in these more hyper stressed states and keep kind of looping. She uses the metaphor of a dog trying to lick a rash to make it better, but ending up making it worse. So I'm going to be coming up with some tips for dealing with death anxiety on the next few slides, both from me and from Megan Devine, but you might be thinking just for a second here, what are your strategies? And of course, I'm always glad to hear them. Okay, so as I mentioned, I struggled with death anxiety for about 10 years, pretty seriously. In some ways, it was because my mom was working as a grief counselor, and then I was working as a grief counselor or doing death and dying work during that time, working at hospice. And so I was just around death a lot and worrying about it a lot. And this really culminated when I was working as a grief counselor with all of these dogs in the oncology unit who would get cancer in all these weird places. And so I kept going into my doctor, asking her to check different parts of me for cancer. And one of the last ones was when I went in for a bump on my toe, which I was worried was cancer because a dog had gotten cancer in their toe. It turned out it was just a callus from my new running shoes. And she looked me in the eye, my doctor, and said, "Girl, you have cancer on the brain." And I don't mean literally. So I had to kind of check myself on that. So here's some of my strategies that I used a lot during that time and still do periodically. So these first three kind of go together: predict, make, and tell. When my husband's getting ready to fly on a plane, which is one of kind of the things that triggers my death anxiety, I will often talk to him about it in a joking way. I'll say, okay, you make sure that pilot flies safe, because this would be a really crappy time for me to have you die this week. I've got too much going on. In terms of getting outside, right? As with any anxiety, it can feel really paralyzing. And so the more we can kind of get outside in nature, move our bodies, that can help. Cell phones have been really helpful, because instead of just worrying, we can reach out and make sure that the person is okay, or check them on Find My, check their location and make sure they're okay. The challenge is, of course, when they're not answering their phone, when it's turned off, or they're out of service, or they just aren't looking at it, then it can really escalate our death anxiety. This strategy of sending out our love, I picked that up from a therapist, that when you're unable to contact someone and you're worrying about them, you can send out your love for them and imagine it coming back. Giving up trying to figure out what will happen. So during my time of my decade of death anxiety, I was often running through all these scenarios, like, if Jordan dies tonight on the plane, what will I do tomorrow? And what will I do the next day? And will I move back home to be near my parents? And so I was doing all of that evolutionary rehearsing to try to ensure my survival, but also making myself crazy. And so I finally got to a point where I would just say to myself, if a significant loss happens, I don't know how I'll deal with it, but I know that I have resources and I trust that I can cope with it. Similarly, a funny story is I had high death anxiety right before my wedding. I was afraid that if somebody died, we wouldn't be able to get married. And my minister, really challenged me on that. She said, Ashley, you can't go through your guest list and write, if you die, we will have the wedding. If you die, we won't have the wedding. You just have to, if it happens, we will figure it out. The last one was probably the biggest thing that helped me was, and it's along the lines of that my father-in-law stripping the gear idea, was just reminding myself of all the hell I had put myself through, literally more than 100 times of panicking and rehearsing the death of myself or people close to me, and realizing that nothing bad came of that. And so did I really want to keep doing that to myself? Here's some of Davine's strategies that may overlap some of mine and might be different. So this magical thinking, this is this idea that our thoughts can influence or kind of have an unrealistic impact on reality. So it's this belief that because death is my biggest fear, it's going to happen to me, right? Or because I'm not a perfect person, someone's going to punish me by making me having to deal with hard things. Or if I don't say, make sure that pilot flies safe, then that's going to lead to your death, right? And so I have to kind of say these things, these kind of magical thinking. So the first is just kind of realizing that we're doing that, kind of catching ourselves doing that. Self-trust, again, is that idea of just trusting that we will handle and we've got resources. Neutrality, so we don't necessarily, if like trying to get rid of it just seems like unrealistic and too kind of Pollyanna-ish, we can just try to get ourselves out of an activated fear state and just in a more neutral state. Looking out for strategies to calm the nervous system, to activate the parasympathetic nervous system. We know a lot now about things like mindfulness and breathing. Davine's strategy is exhaling longer than you inhale to help turn it on. My students also tell me things like the cold water dunks, or even putting cold water on your face or drinking cold water can help shift the nervous system. And then, of course, self-care, which we'll be talking about throughout this class, because it is something that students really need to amp up, because we're reading and discussing and talking about such difficult things throughout the semester. So I've listed some ideas here for self-care. You have the ones that you probably like to use. I just encourage you to look over this list, kind of think for a moment about what you do for self-care, what you're going to be doing, for example, after you listen to a lecture in this class or after you read a tough reading, which of these things kind of work for you to help you feel better. And for a lot of students, I'll say in this class, it's debriefing, actually, with family and friends. If you can teach somebody else what you're learning, talk about what you're reading or listening to in lecture, not only will you retain the information, but it's also kind of a way of processing it, discharging your stress, and connecting with somebody else around it. So as we begin to wrap up this PowerPoint, I'll bring us back to that kind of, we're talking about death, but we're also talking about life. And so this question, what does learning or talking about death teach us about life and living? And I encourage you to listen to the Sarah Bareilles song, Chasing the Sun, and think about kind of how you would answer this question. Students often say things like it's about kind of really trying to live intentionally. They talk about how we have the capacity for immense amount of pain and sorrow, but also joy and resilience, about not leaving things unsaid or taking things for granted. You might have different ideas. So Sally Carrioth was my death and dying undergraduate instructor, and this is a quote from her that became one of my mantras in life. Life is not a dress rehearsal. Every day you should have at least one exquisite moment. And so that really shapes how I try to live, kind of thinking about, what if this is, my last day, how am I going to make the most of it? Now, I will admit that sometimes I can take that too far. You've got to find the middle zone on that, because sometimes I can be like, wow, this was a really crappy day. I don't want this to be my last day. And I can almost stress myself out about it. So take it kind of lightly, right? All right. Okay, so this was introductory information, and then we'll continue on in the next lecture.